Hey there, welcome to the DFS Build NBA edition. I'm Kevin Roberts, ready to go over this showdown slate for the Knicks and Pacers game. Game 6, Pacers are down in a 3-2 hole here. They need to win to force the Game 7. They are at home, so they have a chance. I mean, the last two games have been blowouts, a lot of blowouts in general in the NBA. So if we're going to look at how yesterday's NBA showdown slate went, we could certainly just go in and say, fuck it. Pacers are going to blow the Knicks out. They're going to force the Game 7. Let's stack the Pacers side of the game and go, just assume the Knicks guys are going to be underwhelming. Certainly a viable strategy, and that's something I didn't really talk about in my previous Showdown NBA slates. It's not a foolproof strategy, but showdowns in general, you can just pick a side and stack a team, whether it be 3-2, 4-1. Obviously you can't go 5-zip for the stacking, but if you want to go heavy on one team, you can certainly do that. The downside, of course, is that one team may not always have the guys who offer the best projection or the best ceiling. So even if you're on the right team who ends up winning and has the most productive players, you still might be short of the number one or that second guy who you actually really need. So it's not a foolproof strategy. Yesterday, if you went very, very Minnesota heavy, I think you would have been, on the right track for sure. So I didn't really dive into that part of it. So definitely something to consider every time you're building lineups, especially if you're building a lot of them, because you can, tweak lineup optimizers to go a bit heavier on one side or heavier on positions and stuff like that. So definitely to be considered. When I'm building, especially if I'm building for a single entry, I'm not really that focused on that side of it. That's, for me, that's more of like an MLB or NFL thing, just because there's more correlation with those sports, in my opinion. But it's not something to be completely forgotten. So this game has a decent total, 215. I did not check the spread. Let me check. I'm sure it's close, and I'm sure Indiana is favored because they're at home. Let me pull up the odds real quick. That's my guess, is that they're favored. Yeah, they're big favorites, actually. 6.5-point favorites and 215.5 total. So the Knicks are going to be without OG Anunoby. We know they're still without Mitchell Robinson, Bojan Bogdanovic, Julius Randle, and then obviously Indy is without Benedict Mathurin. So those are the big injuries. Nobody else is on the injury report, so I wouldn't expect anything to change. So starting with the captain slot, unlike yesterday where I felt like I wanted to limit my captain pool, and I believe Anthony Edwards, who was my favorite in my top leverage play off of Jokic in the captain spot, I believe he ended up being in the winning lineup in the captain slot, and he's like 14% owned. Let me check one of the bigger entries I was in real quick. Sorry for not having this up beforehand. Let's see. So, all right. So actually, okay. Yeah, so it was, people were Minnesota heavy. It was not Anthony Edwards. It was Jaden. Jaden McDaniels went freaking off, 21 real points. So he ended up being viable in the captain. Naz Reid was another guy in the captain that worked out. Aaron Gordon was like the only Denver player who actually played above expectation. So he was also in the captain. So honestly, you did not have Anthony Edwards and Jokic and these big guys in the captain a lot in this game. But to be fair, this is an outlier game where it just was an absolute wrecking, like 45-point game. So guys like Naz Reid just like thrived off the bench. Aaron Gordon was like the only Denver player that actually panned out. And then, if you're going to win by 45 points and beat the Nuggets like that, somebody like Jaden McDaniels is going to step up and have a crazy game. So that kind of illustrates that again, what I said yesterday, you can do whatever you want in the captain spot. If you want to go play Aaron Gordon, Naz Reid, or Jaden freaking McDaniels, you can. I don't think that is what is normally going to help you win, though. But my approach to this game, or this showdown slate, is a little bit different than yesterday. My player pool for the captain slot is a lot bigger than yesterday. So I still want to echo that sentiment that yesterday, again, illustrated that, but just in general, you really can play anybody for the most part. But when you're dealing with guys with just really, really good projections, high ceilings, high floors, like Jaylen Brunson's probably the one, obviously, that stands out the most for this game. It's tough to fade them completely, and it's also very tough to get away from them in the captain slot. However, once again, I am not going to be paying for Brunson in the captain slot just because I want to be able to get different right away. I will be eating the Brunson chalk in utility, but you can certainly entertain not doing that. A couple of reasons why. Obviously, number one, we saw it a few games ago in this series, and that's he could always get hurt. So if Jaylen Brunson gets hurt or just really has a terrible game, you could benefit immensely from fading him. I mean, he has a couple of games in the series, and by the way, they were both in Indiana, where he had only like 40 fantasy points or something. Yeah, both those games, he had 35 and 32 fantasy points. He had another game with 45 fantasy points. So while he's exhibited a ceiling, he has 2 games with 59 plus fantasy points. He's also shown a bit of a floor in the series. That could be a little bit because he was dealing with injury, and it almost definitely was, because in game 2, he got hurt. He left. He only played 32 minutes. He still put up 45 fantasy points. The next 2 games in Indy, I think he was kind of feeling the effects of that injury. So it probably explains it. And I think he kind of snapped back in the last game when he popped off for 44 real points. So long story short, I love Brunson. He's the best projecting player, the best captain play by a mile. He's in the optimal lineup 52% of the time. I think you're going to want him in your lineup for sure. And I think if you're doing a lot of entries, you're going to want him in the captain slot a good amount. I'd probably go 50-50 here. I'd go Brunson, and then I would start splitting it up with other guys. But yeah, he's a great play. The other guys I like the most for the captain slot are going to be Tyrese Halliburton, Pascal Siakam, and probably Josh Hart, just because we know he has triple-double upside. We know he's a decent bet to get double-double. He's on the floor a ton, and he just does a little bit of everything. I mean, he had a terrible game 4, but he came back and bounced back with 41 fantasy points and a double-double in the most recent game, game 5. So he literally has had a double-double in 4 of 5 games in the series, and we know he can get to a triple-double. He can hit threes. He can get steals. He literally does everything. So love Josh Hart as a pivot away from Brunson in the captain slot. If you want to go on the Indiana side with them being at home, maybe today's version of Minnesota, I would start off with Tyrese Halliburton, who has been pretty good lately. He had 63 and 58 fantasy points in games 2 and 3. And then he was on pace for a really big game in game 4. He had 37 fantasy points in 28 minutes. He was on pace for probably another decent game in the game 5. He still played 34 minutes, had 30 fantasy points, but obviously that game was a blowout. Didn't play the entire game. But I don't think he's going to have much issue here. The Pacers just run faster and play better at home in general. Big reason why they won both the home games in the series against the Knicks. So I like him quite a bit. And then Siakam is very, very interesting because we know he has a ceiling. In the first 2 games against the Bucks, in the first round, he had 62 fantasy points per game. He has not exhibited that ceiling in this series yet, but in 2 of the last 3 games, he did have 22 plus real points. So can he explode as a scorer? Can he get some of those peripheral stats in a must-win game 6 like this? I think it's certainly possible. So he is very interesting also. So right now, there is no ownership. It's very early in the day. And honestly, even when I checked later, closer to lock yesterday, a lot of lineup optimizers did not have ownership up. So that is, I think they did have it for the utility for overall ownership, but not captain. So you're just going to have to guess until you get close to lock and that comes out. In my opinion, probably Brunson is going to be the chalkiest captain because he just projects way better than everybody else, and he's just the best optimal play right now. So actually double check that. Look at DFS Hero. Yeah, he's the most optimal play for the captain slot. Is that for everywhere? No. So yeah, for the captain slot, he's the most optimal play. Most optimal play overall is Miles Turner based on price. And then our boy here, Tyrese Halliburton, is also in there for sure too. Now, like I said, you can do whatever you want. You can look at the fact that somebody like Miles McBride is playing like 40 minutes now with OG Anunoby out. Let's see, what did he play? Pretty sure he played 40 minutes last game. Where is he? There he is. 40 minutes, 25 fantasy points. So unlike last slate, we do not have a Jokic. There is no Luka in this game either, where there is a guy who is like a really, really good logical bet to get 60-plus fantasy points. The only guy that really is like that in this game is Brunson. But if you want to look at maybe he's been dealing with injuries, maybe he's due for an off game, maybe he just cannot play that well in this stadium or arena, and he struggled in the other 2 games in Indy. If all that happens again and Brunson just gets like 40 to 45 fantasy points, all the more reason to not captain him and just go look at really anybody else. I mean, could this just be a decent game where, Halliburton, Brunson, Siakam, Miles Turner, all these solid plays just get like 45 fantasy points. Nobody goes completely nuclear. Absolutely it could. And if it does, you kind of can get away with anybody in the captain slot, I think. It just still needs to be somebody who's going to play a good amount of the game, somebody who's a good per minute guy, and somebody that is obviously not going to be really owned. Having said that, I like everybody here. Everybody looks good. Dante DiVincenzo, he's going to play a ton in a close game. And in this series, he has 2 games with over 46 fantasy points. And in 4 of the games, he has 30-plus fantasy points. He looks so super good as a captain option. Miles Turner, he has been smashing. He had 43 fantasy points in Game 3. Was on pace for a huge game in Game 4 with 30 fantasy points. And in Game 5, obviously, he was limited a little bit by the blowout and still had 33 fantasy points. So he is getting it done. Love Miles Turner as a captain option as well. Isaiah Hartenstein, he's not really scoring in this series that much. He did okay in the first 2 games, averaged 13.5 points per game. Hasn't topped 8 points since then, but he's rebounding well. He had 17 rebounds in the last game, 37 fantasy points. Indiana is a very soft matchup down low across the board. So if Hartenstein can somehow get going scoring-wise, he looks like a really, really good play across the board. He had 39 minutes in the last competitive game. I wouldn't glean too much from the last 2 games, which were blowouts. So you can play anybody at captain. I would probably start with Brunson, Halliburton, Hart, Siakam, and then that second tier is going to be DiVincenzo, Turner, Hartenstein. If you want to start going into value plays, these are more guys that I'm going to be looking to fill up my roster with utility, and that would be TJ McConnell, who I would gladly get away from if we hear he's going to be chalky, though, because he's been very inconsistent. His last 3 games, 12, 40, 14 fantasy points. The problem is he's a good per minute guy. He does offer a ceiling, but he's only going to get like 20 minutes off the bench. So if he's not getting it done, that's going to be bad chalk in a hurry. So totally viable. You can play him. You could even put him in captain if you really want to. That's just probably not something I'm going to do. Aaron Nesmith, his minutes have been shaky last 2 games because blowouts. When the game is close, he's playing upwards of 38 minutes. If his shot is falling, he is viable and looks like a pretty good value here. In the utility, he is coming in at 5.6K, totally fine for me. Andrew Demhard, 5.2. He should push for 30 minutes, but obviously McConnell is going to eat into his role a little bit. He just hasn't really shown up in this series at a high level. So if the ownership leans towards him, I would prefer McConnell just because the extra minutes aren't really distancing him from McConnell. McConnell's a better per minute guy. So yeah, that's what I'd do with those 2 guys. I would rank them right now. I'd rank them Nesmith, McConnell, Nemhard. I prefer Miles McBride over Alec Burks, but both these guys are very, very viable. Alex Burke has now played 21 plus minutes in each of the last 3 games. That has helped him get 25 plus fantasy points in each of the last 3 games. So like it or not, Alec Burks is 100% viable. You could even put him in the captain. If he goes and busts and pops for 35 plus fantasy points, you're going to load up your roster with all these guys capable of getting 40, 45 plus fantasy points, like I've been saying. So do I like playing a cheap, volatile Alec Burks in the captain slot? No. The reason why is because he has a very, very low floor. He's been crushing as a scorer with 14 plus points in each of the last 3 games. If he doesn't hit his shots, he is going to bust in a big way, and then you're just totally screwed if he's in your captain slot. It's less of an issue if he's just your value in the utility, which is probably how I will be using him. That said, he's 4.4K in the utility, and Miles McBride is 4.8. Miles McBride gets way more minutes, so I'm going to lean with the minutes. If it turns out, though, that because of the safety with McBride, McBride is like mega chalk and Alec Burks is going completely overlooked, we can absolutely make a pivot there. And you really can pair them too. You can play both of them just because they're really way too cheap for the run they're getting in the series. Other guys that are definitely viable. Obi Toppin, feeling a little bit pricey for the showdown considering the other values you can go to at cheaper prices here. But he's going to get about 20 minutes. He's been shaky lately, 9, 23, 15 fantasy points. So he's just a volatile player, but at 4.2, we definitely can keep him in our player pool. Precious Achiuwa is getting 20 to 25 minutes. Actually 22 plus in each of the last 4 games, thanks to the injuries for the Knicks. Not a super high-end role, but he's a decent per minute guy. He's been getting 14 plus fantasy points in each of those 4 games. So decent value. I wouldn't captain him personally, but he's a solid value if you think he can have a good game. Ben Shepherd continues to get minutes. He had 25 minutes last game. That is courtesy of the blowout, but you can expect him to get 15 plus minutes. He does not do much when he's out there. That's the downside. But he is really cheap at 2.8K, especially if he's going to go overlooked. He's very interesting. Isaiah Jackson saw his minutes get yanked in the last game, only 6. So if we can't trust his minutes, he's going to be tough. But at 2.4K, he's still viable just because he's a good per minute guy, and that's really, really cheap. But the blowout also impacted things a little bit. I mean, you even had Milton get in there for a little bit in the fourth quarter. Let's see, Jarace Walker. I mean, it's like you can't really pay much mind to those unless you're thinking it's going to be a blowout. Jericho Sims played 3 minutes. Yeah, I'm not really going to go that deep with what I'm doing. I'm going to go Knicks heavy in general, though, because we know the Knicks get just ground to a pulp. Like Tibbs loves to play his guys. So when Miles McBride is getting 40 minutes, you know that philosophy rings true. You can still play Alec Burks and Precious Achiuwa for sure, but I would definitely be leaning heavy on Brunson, Hart, DiVincenzo, Hartenstein, and Miles McBride, and that's where I would, start, prioritizing guys here. Overall, though, this is a really interesting game. There's just a plethora of options to feel really, really good about. If I had to close out with one single strategy, it's as simple as this. Love Brunson. I'll lock Brunson in, but he's sliding over to utility. At captain, if I'm running numerous lineups, I'm just going to try a bunch of different combinations and play with the lineup optimizer at DFS Hero, which, by the way, you can check it out for 15% off if you hit the link below. Just like play around, even run their sims and just see what really pops and kind of make decisions based off of that. In the captain slot, there are so many different ways to go. My favorite way to go as far as upside and ownership leverage right now is going to be either Pascal Siakam or Josh Hart. Honestly, you legitimately can play anybody in the captain slot on this specific showdown slate just because so many good per minute guys here. It's going to be an up-tempo running matchup in Indy. Knicks get so many minutes, and the Pacers have so many guys that can deliver. So it's a tough one to really dissect, to be honest, but it could be an interesting one. I think there's very easy, quick leverage with Brunson, just like we talked about a few slates ago. So a few slates ago, it was Halliburton who is my preferred guy, but right now I'm liking Siakam a lot with Josh Hart. All right, I don't want to keep repeating myself. It's a showdown slate. There's only so much that can be said, but a lot of different ways to go, and hopefully this helped a little bit. If it did, please give this video a like and also consider subscribing to the channel. Good luck.